Welcome, everybody. I guess this is the fifth or sixth time. It's hard for me to believe that. And if I listened to the Army spokesman last night, this is going to go on for a year. I really can't comprehend that, to be quite honest with you. But that's what he said last night. It's going to be a year of milchama, a year of war. Israel's not built that way, to be quite honest with you. Neither is the IDF built for long wars. The IDF was always built for short wars. That was the whole concept of short wars, but this seems to be a long war, and not long in terms of there was the war of attrition took place over a 2 year period, but it wasn't full scale war. And the Lebanon war, the major part ended after the seizure of Beirut, or the encircling of Beirut, let's put it that way, and when the PLO left. So this is something very different, and ultimately something very concerning, to say the least. Uh, we have 4 or 5 main areas to discuss at the moment. Area number one is what's going on in Gaza. So in Gaza, the army spokesman said last night that the northern part of Gaza, we have completed dismantling the Hamas infrastructure. What that means is not totally clear. It is fairly clear that we've not found all of the tunnels there. And yesterday it was announced that Lieutenant Colonel was killed in northern Gaza, I guess on Shabbat. It's not clear if Shabbat or Friday afternoon. So that was the area that we have no longer considered a strategic threat. The center of Gaza is very much still being fought over in the refugee camps in the center, places like Deir el-Balach and the 2 other camps that are there. The Hamas has not been defeated there. There's heavy fighting going on in those 2 refugee camps. And finally, there's Khan Yunis. And Khan Yunis is where they talk about 300 kilometers, excuse me, of Hamas tunnels underneath. We are fighting inside the tunnels. According to one report today, we've captured 15% of the tunnels. I don't know. Talking about another month to finish Khan Yunis, and there's this, and I wrote this a couple of days ago, I think an absurd expectation that we're going to find Sinwar and the hostages under Khan Yunis. I mean, I don't see any reason why they have not left to go to Rafiq by now. Where we're not doing anything about, because there are a million refugees sitting in Rafiq, and it's going to be very difficult to operate. Plus, the Egyptians aren't going to be happy. So I'm concerned, let's put it that way, that I'm not sure, where this goes. I'm not sure how we reach the goal that we talk about, which is total dismantling of Hamas, and removing it from power. It's not going to be easy. No one said it was going to be easy, but I'm not really sure where, how we go from here to there, especially because we do not have a political solution in mind. This government can't have a political solution in mind, because this government will fall the minute it puts together a plan for the day after in Gaza, because part of this government believes in resettling Gaza, and part of it keeps on talking about the Gazans leaving on their own will to go somewhere else. Something we've always wanted, but I wouldn't be unhappy if they all disappeared, as long as we didn't have to kill them or something. But it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Any thought it is very problematic. And we'll get back to the problematic of it when we discuss The Hague in a little while. So slow, constant progress, yes. Is the army doing well in Gaza from a tactical standpoint? Without a doubt, very successful tactically. Strategically, I don't know. I'm not sure I understand for this moment why we're doing things one after the other as opposed to all together, other than a certain limit of our forces, which we'll come back to in a minute when it comes to the fact that what happens in the north or can happen in the north. So casualties have been down, this we have to say. Casualties have been significantly down. I don't want to, as they say, liftoch pele satan, which means open your mouth to the devil. But in the last week or so, casualties have been much lower. That's partly a result of less troops being in certain areas. It's partly a result of the fact that they're being more careful. And so that's good. It's more than good. That's excellent. And we'll have to see if that can continue. That's sort of Gaza. I'm sure you'll have questions about that, but that's where we stand. Slow, steady progress, but time is passing. I mean, we're 93 days into this war. And, the country that conquered what it conquered in 6 days is now 93 days and hasn't finished conquering Gaza. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, and it's not equivalent, and the tunnels and the preparation and all that. But just keep that in mind as a rule of thumb, so to speak, or however you want to look at it. Let's go to the north now, which could be the most problematic area. Not at all clear. So it's very problematic in the sense that there's been a war of attrition going on in the northern border now from the second or third day of the war. All of our people who live within 4 kilometers of the border have been moved out of the border, and they're all living in hotels in different parts of the country, as, by the way, are the people from the Gaza border area. The Gaza border area, keep in mind, though, those people are living in communities together. They evacuated the Gaza border in groups. The people from the north were evacuated wherever they could find them hotel rooms. So I believe the numbers in Kiryat Shmona, they're in 60 different hotels dispersed all over the country, which means their kids are going to 60 different schools practically. Maybe a few concentrations here and there, but just imagine what that is. So basically, we've given up the 4 kilometers within the border, which includes two significant cities, Kiryat Shmona and Shlomi, plus all the kibbutzim, moshavim along the border, and Metulov. Nobody's living in any of those places. Everyone is outside. And no one's willing to go back, obviously, until something is done. The firing from Lebanon is extremely deadly in the sense that what's being fired within line of sight are anti-tank weapons. Those are line of sight. In other words, they can't be fired unless you can see the target. So if you can see the target, they can be fired. There's no warning, because by the time a warning would take place, the rocket, which is going straight horizontally, as opposed to it's a missile, so to speak, as opposed to a rocket that goes up in the air and comes down and is timed to intercept. There's no possibility, except in the last seconds, to intercept, and that can only be on like a tank can possibly intercept it, but a house can't intercept it. And a significant portion of the houses along the border have been damaged or destroyed over the last 3 months, and that's something to keep in mind. So there's tremendous pressure right now on the government and talking about we need to do something. We need to return the people to the north. The problem is what to do. So there is the discussions, the Americans are discussing with the Lebanese this plan that basically calls for the Lebanese to return, the Hezbollah, to return to the north of the Litani River. In return, Israel will give up some small pieces of land that Hezbollah has always disputed. The area of Shaba Farms, which was the big question, is the area Syrian originally or Lebanese originally? The UN decided in favor of Israel, but the Hezbollah hasn't accepted that, and really it's not all that important to us. And a few other small little points. Is that deal possible? It's possible, and even Nasrallah said that there'll be the opportunity to possibly return key Lebanese land in the near future at the end of this war. So that's a possibility. On the other hand, the 60 rockets that were fired primarily at an Air Force base yesterday, and there are reports that one or two of those rockets got through, although I think it's censored here, and I don't think the reports have really gotten out. They're just on social media, so I don't really know whether it's true or not. But in any case, that was clearly an escalation. That was a response, of course, to our assassination of al-Haruri, the Hamas person inside Lebanon. Neither side wants a war. Let's be realistic here. those in Israel who are calling for us to take immediate action and go to war don't fully understand or don't care fully understand what the consequences of a full-scale war with Hezbollah will be. First of all, we're assuming the IDF can win everything, and yes, eventually that's true, but the cost is going to be heavy, both in terms of the IDF and, of course, what's going to happen to the cities of Israel. Well, first of all, there's no question that anything north of Haifa in the north will have to be evacuated, and B, even serious strategic infrastructure places could be hurt. All sorts of things could happen um, because Hezbollah has larger weapons, more accurate weapons than Hamas ever did. So let's say it's not the best of circumstances. If there's a war, that's an understatement. Also, the IDF is really not ready for another war right away. We don't fully comprehend what the effect on fighting personnel and equipment is of been fighting those people who've been in Gaza, be they on the border or they're in Gaza. Some of them now with very brief respites for 3 months. Once again, that is the Israeli army is not the American army. It's not designed the same way. It doesn't have the logistics training that the American army does. It doesn't put the same effort into logistics. And soldiers don't expect, especially reserve soldiers, to go to war for 3 months, 6 months, who knows how long. So a war right now in Lebanon is very, very problematic. Let's put it that way. On the other hand, there's no easy solution unless Hezbollah goes for this deal, and it's not at all clear that they're willing to go for this deal. So we don't know um, what can happen or will happen if we go that way. So that's really Lebanon. I wish I could say I knew what's going to happen. I know what I'm hoping doesn't happen. And I'm hoping somehow we find a way of delaying this war, finding a solution. I just don't think it's a price that we're going to want to pay for what would happen in terms of Lebanon at this point. There are others who think we have to just take our fate into our own hands. Maybe they're right. I don't know. But first of all, we need to finish with Hamas if we can finish with Hamas. And if we can't finish with Hamas, how can we finish with Hezbollah? Which is a much more significant fighting force and much further from our borders. I mean, let's be honest. In order to finish with Hezbollah, we have to invade Lebanon and get to the Beirut area. We have the means of doing it, but once again, I go back to the issue of logistics and everything else. We are not set up for, and we can do it, but it's a strain. We are not set up to fight a war at a distance, and we'll see. Area number 3. The West Bank, Yehuda what's going on there? This was not a good day there, let's put it that way. It started with a shooting attack. It ended up being an Arab Israeli from East Jerusalem who was shot, but he was shot in a car to the north of Jerusalem, and he died. It actually really started last night, when last night a group of Magavnikim, Border Patrol soldiers, entered into Jenin, which they do all the time because Jenin has some similarities to Gaza these days. And they were met with an IED that exploded. It killed one of the soldiers and wounded another group of soldiers. That resulted in a 5 or 6 hour battle that they needed a helicopter gunship to help rescue them till they could pull the wounded soldiers out, the vehicle out, and of course the dead soldier. And I believe 6 Palestinians, terrorists, were killed in that battle. About an hour ago, there was a ramming attack in also sort of Jerusalem, Givat Ze'ev area of Jerusalem, and two people were lightly wounded. The terrorist was killed, but now there are reports that somehow, while killing the terrorist, we seem to have killed a 3-year-old Palestinian. That was only initial reports before I got on this call, so I'm not positive about it, but that seems to be the case. So the West Bank was quieter immediately after the beginning of this war. This last week, it's started to get more active, shall we say. Hamas is strong in the West Bank. We've arrested over 2,000 Hamas and other Jihad Islamic and some of the PLO people. Our jails are full, and but that hasn't stopped them completely, but has cut down. Houthis. The Houthis continue to attack international shipping despite a threat from the United States and Great Britain. If they don't stop, they're going to take action. What action they can take is a little unclear. The Saudis did not succeed in a period of a year or two to actually defeat the Houthis. Of course, the U.S. is more powerful and more capable, but still, the Houthis don't seem to care and don't seem to be worried too much about what the United States and Britain says, at least up till now. Let's go. Two other things. The Hague I want to bring up right now. The Hague is where the International Court of Justice is located. South Africa has brought a case to the International Court of Justice, basically claiming that we are in the midst of a genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. Okay, to prove genocide requires two things. One, intent, and B, the actual actions of things that have taken place. And the court can do one of three things. They can decide not to take the case, so there isn't enough here to even discuss it. They can take the case and take no interim action. Cases in the International Court of Justice take years generally to adjudicate. Or they can enter into temporary injunctions. Those could be maintain all the evidence, or don't do genocide, which Israel will claim it's not doing in any case, or they could do stop the war. Those are the different possibilities. Now, when they come up with a judgment, it's now international law, which can create all sorts of difficulties for Israel. Interestingly, and I guess it's more than ironic, Prime Minister Netanyahu has asked Aaron Barak, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who the right made into this terrible figure over the last 6 months of the judicial reform, claiming he's the one responsible for all this left-wing activism on the court, and he was literally the poster child for the right wing about this terrible person who hated the state of Israel. And they were demonstrating near his house. It's only a few blocks from my apartment. They were demonstrating repeatedly in front of his house against Aaron Barak. I think he's 90 or 89, and he retired for many, many years. But he was the poster child from the right wing for judicial activism and everything else. At any rate, Prime Minister Netanyahu has asked Barak to join the judges. What does that mean? When the International Court of Justice has 15 judges, they come from all over the world. Most of them are Western, a few from other countries. But when a country is either the one who prosecutes a case and the one who defends, is allowed to appoint a judge who can join the other judges to discuss, and discuss the case and try to convince the other judges, and of course, as a judge, not as a prosecutor or as a defender. Israel has, I think, a British Jew, I don't remember his name, who's going to represent Israel in terms of defense. But Aaron Barak, the terrible left-winger who the right wing claims hates Israel, has been appointed or asked to, and he's accepted the job to be a judge on the International Court of Justice on behalf of Israel. So I guess that's Freudenschein, as they say, or whatever that word is that I'm not pronouncing correctly. Domestic politics is the last thing that I want to discuss, or where we stand with that, which is sort of war-related in a very strong way. So I wrote about last night the the Security Cabinet meeting that was to took place Thursday night. The purpose of the meeting was for the first time to discuss the plan for the day after. So two plans were presented that were relatively similar, that basically had Israel responsible for security matters, some international group, theoretically led by the United States, responsible for overall administration and economic development and everything else. And then the local Azatim, the Gazans, would be responsible for day-to-day operations like sewerage and all those sort of things. The same people who are doing it until now, assuming they're not members of Hamas, which is a big assumption. And then also Egypt would be responsible for the border crossing, but Israel would be the one responsible to make sure nothing came in. That plan, obviously, like I said before, would not be acceptable to the two far-right ministers in the cabinet. I also am not sure that that plan is feasible. Someone asked me overnight, sent me a comment and said, you know, did Washington say it's all interested in doing that? And I guess the guy is from Washington, said, you know, the feeling here is no such, you know, the United States is not at all interested in doing that. And we're living in a little bit of a make-believe world, I guess it is, because we think everything is the way we want it to be. So I'm not sure the Americans are at all on board with their involvement. I think they're on board with the general concept, but how that general concept gets converted is a whole other question. But leave that part aside for a moment. What happened in the cabinet meeting after, not afterwards, as soon as the cabinet ministers, they presented, and then it was up to cabinet ministers to discuss what they had just heard. Instead of discussing what they just heard, Miri Regev started, and a bunch of Likud people started attacking the chief of staff, starting with he had appointed or was planning to appoint a group of former generals to look at what the army did wrong, not the government, not the politics, but just what the army did wrong, so it doesn't make these mistakes again. And they started attacking him for doing it. They started attacking him because the person he had appointed with chief of staff Mofaz was the chief of staff during the time of the withdrawal from Gaza. Now, leaving aside the fact that Mofaz is well thought of, the reality is there are very few chiefs of staff that he could have picked that were far enough back in history and still alive and fully functional, who were not involved in the events of the last 10 years in the planning of the IDF. Any of the more recent chiefs of staff are very problematic. You can't have someone like Kochavi, who was just the chief of staff, or even Eisenkot, or even before that. I mean, these people were involved in how the army is set up and how it responded in terms of plans, etc., etc. So you had to go all the way back to get somebody to do that. And of course, Mofaz is tainted with the fact that he was involved in the withdrawal, but he was following orders, so to speak. So, and again, that's a whole big question. The right wing has still been obsessed about with the withdrawal. I want to make one last point, and this is an opinion issue, and that has to do with the valuableness or lack of valuableness of settlements, generally speaking. The Zionist movement believed in settling because they believed where we settled would prove the demarcations of the state of Israel when the partition time came about, or whatever the plan would be. They were right. In 1947, the British partition plan basically followed lines of wherever there was Jewish settlements, that was going to be in the Jewish state. Where there were no Jewish settlements, there was going to be in the Arab state. And that was absolutely correct for the time. The question now has become, do settlements add to or detract from our security? So on one level, we can look back historically. The settlements in the Golan Heights, which were very young settlements in 1973, were immediately evacuated. The settlements we have all along the northern border and the southern border also have all been evacuated. But you could say they were tripwire, right? In other words, because the settlements were there, they were attacked by Hamas, and therefore they spent time fighting in the settlements, and therefore they didn't get to Beersheba or other places because the settlements were the first line they fought. There is some truth to that. On the other hand, you could have had more army soldiers there instead of settlements. But lastly, and this is the really important thing, I think there is an argument to be made for settlements along a border. There is no argument to be made for settlements in the middle of nowhere. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about all of the 3 dozen, 4 dozen what was once illegal settlements, but are now legal settlements, sprinkled all over the West Bank for the sake of argument, that are in the middle of nowheres, in areas that are surrounded by Arab areas that are almost impossible to defend. And they do not add to our defense. The reason there were so few soldiers on the Gaza, at least no, let me rephrase that. One of the reasons there were so few soldiers on the Gaza border was because a lot of them were defending the settlements in the West Bank, because they require a lot of people to defend. They're in the middle of Badlands, if any way to call it that. And very, very problematic from a military standpoint. You want to make political arguments? Go right ahead. You want to say every piece of the land of Israel, God gave it to us, and therefore we have to settle every piece? Make the religious arguments all you want. Don't make the military arguments, because the military arguments are just false. They are a burden on the army to have to defend all the settlements at this point. And any idea of putting settlements back in Gaza, it's a terrible idea. It required a lot of soldiers to protect the settlements that were in Gaza back when. I remember when I served in Gaza, which was a long, long time ago, the settlements were brand new. And that was a time when Gaza was relatively quiet up to the point where, only one of our half tracks was blown up by a IED at the time, and only this and a few nice incidents. And this was back in 1981, I think it was, or 80. So settlements are very problematic from a strategic standpoint or from a military standpoint. Okay, we've gotten to the halfway point, and now we'll turn to questions. Please, put up your hand or whatever, and hopefully I'll see you.
Mark, my hand is not working. Can I ask a question?
Yes, go right ahead.
There were a couple of articles this week, one prominently in the Wall Street Journal, and I think another one in the New York Times, focusing on the individuals who are I'll call them the Hamas financiers, the bankers who basically provide not the original funds, but basically arrange for Hamas funding, and have been extremely successful in doing that. And obviously, Hamas could not exist without that funding. Would Israel entertain, basically hits on these guys, like it hit the guy in Lebanon, or because they're not actually quote unquote fighters, would Israel just try other ways to choke the funding?
Well, I think they would consider hitting them. I don't think that anything would stop us from hitting them if we can. I do remind you that last night, if you read the update, I included the press release from the State Department, where the State Department is offering up to $10 million reward for anyone who has information on any of these individuals and other funding sources for Hamas. Clearly, drawing up their funding is very important. They learned in the whole war on terror, funding is a key aspect, and drawing that up is an important thing. So I think the answer is yes, and other methods need to be taken. The United States is in the best position from the financial standpoint of freezing them out, because it can freeze out any secondary or tertiary banks that are working with them in any which way, because the U.S. has that power. So if they're working with a bank somewheres, the United States can tell that bank, sorry, you're going to get sanctions against you. You're not going to be allowed to operate in the United States or receive wires and everything else. And that bank, of course, is not interested for whatever money Hamas has. And so the U.S. can be the best, but again, it requires intelligence to find all these things. So I think the $10 million will be an incentive for people out there to go searching for where it is.
Thank you.
And maybe this. Anybody else? Just speak up, I guess. I don't see any hands.
Mark?
Yes.
Mark, I'm sorry, I was on mute. It's Barbara Jacobs. I have one quick question and one less quick. The quick one is, over all the years when the materials were coming into Gaza to build the tunnels, did this come in through Egypt, through the Mediterranean? How did they get this in? And the other question is, what are the scenarios that Netanyahu will lose power and we can get rid of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir?
Okay, so the first question, it's two parts to that. The tunnels themselves were basically dual use. In other words, concrete, right? Some steel. They had to rebuild after the last war. They had to bring in concrete. All those sort of things are sort of dual use materials that were brought in probably above board. And they were just used to build tunnels as opposed to building buildings. So that part, and it's a real problem. How do you stop Gaza from having any concrete? They have to rebuild all these buildings, right? So that was, and even steel, some of the steel used. As a matter of fact, some of the missiles, they used pipes. They took pipes out of the ground and used them to make missiles. So you always have this problem, what's called dual use material. Any sort of sanction regime has that problem. And so in this case, we have that problem very much so. This scenario, everyone here asks that every moment. So there's only one realistic scenario, and I say realistic only in the sense that it's the only scenario that could work. Well, maybe a second one. The realistic scenario is 5 members of the Likud are willing to have backbone finally and say, if at the end of the war he doesn't resign, doesn't take responsibility, they say enough. Because if you look at all the polls, the Likud does much better with anybody but Netanyahu. So Likud people, even from their own standpoint, will say, okay, until now they kept Netanyahu always because he was considered the vote getter. Now they were afraid of him for other reasons, but he was considered the vote getter, and with the vote getter, they managed to stand him. But now when he can be the albatross on them, I think they may be, maybe. I mean, these people have never shown any willingness to have any backbone, but maybe there'll be 5 of them to have the backbone. The other possibility, less likely, is a decision by Shas that it believes the time is right, then they make some sort of deal and they bring down the government. There's another possibility, of course, and that's if Ben-Gvir and Smotrich decide for their own reasons they need to get out of the government because the government's not fulfilling their dreams, and they can't be part of a government that does not allow the resettlement of Gaza. So they pull out, basically committing harakiri, but they will think they will come out better within their own electorate, and that ends up a reason for forcing new elections. So that's possible too. It's probably my guess, the most likely scenario is Ben-Gvir decides to pull out because he thinks he'll do better. He pulls out and stands on his quote unquote principles, and that's what happens. Let me just pick up something I left out relating to the Hague investigations. In order for a country to be found guilty of genocide, you need 2 things: intent and actions. Now, in terms of intent, what they intend to base it on are the statements of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and a few other of these people who consistently call for removal of the people, that they're terrible people, all the things that they say. They're like walking in, giving our enemies evidence. Unbelievable. They just cannot keep their mouths shut because they're looking for their voters. And who cares about what happens to Israel? My voters are more important than anything else. The other part, of course, is actual events, people being killed, all those sort of things. Clearly, the fact that we requested all of the people to move so that they wouldn't be killed sort of undermines the case that we're trying to kill the people. Because obviously we wanted to kill the people, we could kill many more than those who have been killed. And the fact that we have legal advisors with the Air Force, with every strike being approved by a legal advisor, will provide a reasonably good legal defense. But it's not 100%. And if these people keep on opening their mouths, it will be difficult. Let's put it that way. Someone else started. Yes.
Michael Weiss here. The Times of Israel reported this morning that anonymous leakers from the State Department in Washington to the Washington Post are warning that, excuse me, Netanyahu could deliberately provoke a war with Hezbollah to advance his electoral chances. Is this serious, or is this just a way of people in the State Department delegitimizing any Israeli action in the north?
Okay. I don't have a real answer to that question because we I don't know what's inside Netanyahu's mind. He previously was been against the attack. He's very reluctant to use military force. He always has been. For one of the good things we can say about him is, and it's one of the few good things, he's reluctant to use military force. Sometimes too reluctant, obviously. He would like this war to keep on going. I'm not sure he wants the war in the north to happen because he understands what that means for war in the north. The government. One of the things to keep in mind is the government has been told for the last 10 years to move the petrochemical plants that are sitting just to the north of Haifa to some other place like in the Negev. And there's been a plan for 10 years to do it, 10 years when Netanyahu has been prime minister. And over these 10 years, it hasn't been done. And I don't want to think about the results of a Hezbollah strike hitting those petrochemical plants to the north of Haifa, immediately north of Haifa. So the results of the war would be catastrophic, even if we're successful. And I don't think that is the case. I think more of the case, look, we don't have a good solution. We don't have a good solution. And sometimes we overthink our strength and sometimes we underthink our strength. We don't have a good solution. I don't think Netanyahu will go to war in the north in order to improve his electoral chances. I think he'll stay at war in the south longer in order to put the day after further away to the day after. And when the war ends, that's when people are going to come and say, okay, now it's time for you to take responsibility. And that is what's he's avoided completely. So I think he has an interest in delaying the end to the Gaza operation. Not saying there are other reasons, and it's not maybe wrong on that, but that he has a clear political interest. In terms of actually going to war in the north, I think it's a stretch. But again, I don't know Netanyahu's mind as well as I don't know Nasrallah's mind, to be honest with you. Joel, I've been told, has waited.
Yeah. Yes, on that point, it seems to me, I'd like your view on this. It seems to me that Netanyahu is going to keep this going or at least prevent peace until the American elections. I mean, isn't that his ace in the hole, if you will, that if Trump gets elected, that will give him enough support in the U.S. government to give him a chance to be reelected in Israel?
No, I don't think that's a consideration. I mean, delaying it because for the purpose of delaying it here makes sense. I don't think he's not Putin. Putin's putting all his eggs in Trump being reelected. There's no question about that. One thing Putin wants more than anything else is Trump to be reelected. I'm sure whatever interference he was doing in the 2016 elections, he's doing it 10 times over this time because he has a clear and absolute interest in Trump being elected this time. Netanyahu, it's much more complicated because Netanyahu knows that Trump is incompetent. So Netanyahu is not stupid. He knows Trump is incompetent. And Israel at the moment does not need an incompetent US president. He may say all the right things, but when it comes to actual actions, Trump is problematic and one prefers something that you understand what's going to happen than someone like Trump where anything is possible. So I don't think he's looking for Trump to be reelected. He's certainly not going to hold off the war until then for that purpose. He would try to delay it so he doesn't have to be, meet justice, so to speak. But I think Trump is not a concern and not an issue right now. And of course, in this country, Biden is extremely, extremely popular. If there's an election today between Biden and Trump, Biden in Israel, Biden would get 80% of the votes. So that's something else altogether.
May I ask another question?
Sure.
There was reports here in the States that there was an attack on a car carrying Al Jazeera reporters and journalists, and they were killed. I don't think you've talked about that. Have you heard about that? What was that about?
There was a report of that. I mean, look, it's very possible. Anyone moving in a car in Gaza is making a big mistake at this point because the assumption is it's the Hamas. I'm not sure why one would be in a car moving around Gaza right now, even in Rafah. Israel is hunting Hamas people. Most of them, anyone in a car is a target. I'm sorry. I mean, they don't say the car doesn't say on top. It doesn't say on top press. Let's put it that way. I don't think that Israel's trying to. One of the things that was been said is how many journalists have been killed in Gaza. And there are a large number of journalists, but keep in mind that almost every journalist is also a member of Hamas. You can't be a journalist in Gaza unless you're a member of Hamas, basically. So it's a shame, but most of these people are members of Hamas, and so it's very hard to know. Even this Al Jazeera person, I don't know. I don't know anything about the Al Jazeera person, but most of them are local people who are hired as stringers for Al Jazeera or other places. And again, they're also members of Hamas, and who knows what else they were doing at the time. I don't have the answer. I don't think Israel's targeting journalists, but I think journalists are being killed like anybody else. Some Michael, I've heard. Yes, Beth.
For me? Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, I probably, maybe I think I know the answer to this question, but I just like your opinion. I know Nasrallah has most of the power, but the Christians that are left, I don't even know if the organization's phalanges exists anymore. Do they have any say in the matter, whether it's a full-blown war or not? Is he a puppet of Iran? Or is he a man that's going to make the decision himself?
Okay. He is largely influenced by Iran. He's not totally a puppet because he's a player in Lebanese politics. He considers himself a Lebanese, and he's concerned what's going to happen to Lebanon to some extent. If he wasn't, he would have gone to war already. So the fact is that he is concerned about Lebanon to some extent. And there are other powers in Lebanon. There are still Christians in Lebanon. There are also Sunni Muslims in Lebanon, not Shiite Muslims, which is what Hezbollah is made of, and there are also Druze. None of these people want to go to war with Israel at the moment. But Hezbollah has by far the most guns, much more so than the Lebanese army does. So it's good that there are other forces within Lebanon, but he doesn't have to really worry about them, other than the fact that he doesn't want to be considered the enemy of Lebanon. And that's part of the reason he's held off until now. The other part is Iran. I'm not sure. Iran looks upon Hezbollah's missiles as their second strike, as a second strike weapon for Iran. In other words, if Israel was to attack, or somebody else was to attack the Iranian nuclear program successfully and everything else, they would unleash Hezbollah's missiles on Israel. And that's sort of considered the deterrence that, to some extent, Iran has. I'm not sure they want to wipe out the deterrence in a war right now with Israel, but wars have their own dynamics. Beth.
Okay, so I know I have a couple of questions that I guess I could have asked several meetings ago, but they're still bothering me. Like, one is, we keep getting updates on casualties in Gaza, and it's always from Hamas. When Israel reports something like they found a tunnel or whatever, no one believes them. Like, what you hear that it's been unsubstantiated. And I'm not understanding why this is, well, I don't know, like, why don't we have better PR where we can get out the truth? And, and I guess it's tied into my second question was statement. I mean, and this happened, I guess, right after our last meeting, but it had been something that had been going on when a lot of information came out about what happened to the kids on October 7th. Israel didn't want to, or somebody's not wanting to discuss the horrifying events in detail to the public, to the schools, to the colleges here in the United States and around the world. They're just seeing the horrifying, or what they see as horrifying in Gaza. And I'm not understanding why this isn't, why it's been, I feel like it's been hidden. Like, we hear about it here and there, but it's not been blasted out to the public so they know. It's not on. You have to, like the Israelis here, my daughter-in-law, she knows how to find all these things, and Alex knows how to find all these things, but a lot of these people have no idea how horrifying it was.
Okay, so let's take that in two parts.
Okay.
Number one, part of it seems to be a bias in terms of the media. When Israel says something, it's unsubstantiated, and Hamas, they accept the numbers from Hamas. I mean, which is absurd. Now, I'm not saying a lot of civilians haven't been killed. There's no doubt a lot have been killed, and a lot of children have been killed too. But there is no way to substantiate in any which way those numbers. Does it include the 500, quote unquote, that were killed in that strike on the hospital? It turned out there were like 30 people killed. What are the what numbers? What are the numbers that we're talking about? So, yes, there's a real problem in accepting numbers that come out of Hamas, and the numbers get repeated so many times. And as we know, a lie that gets repeated enough times becomes a fact. So that's problem number one on one side of it. Does Israel do enough hasbara? No, it doesn't. It never did, and we've discussed that before. One of the biggest problems is there isn't enough education, enough hasbara, but it's not just hasbara, it's deep education. People don't understand the conflict, don't understand any facts or anything else like that. That's a real problem, but it requires a tremendous effort. It requires, in my opinion, hundreds of millions of dollars in a long-term plan, and long-term planning is not one of the strengths of the Israeli government. And the Israeli and the American Jewish community likes raising money for emergencies in Israel, a little more complicated to try to raise money on a long-term plan to protect Israel in terms of public opinion and everything else.
But why
Just
did, like,
last point, when we get,
imagine, like, what, like, even the channels on TV, you don't hear about the horrifying event. Like, you hear that they were killed, but not what they did to these people.
okay, so there are two parts to that. First of all, we're getting further and further away from October 7th. And old news versus new news, and there are new casualties every day in Gaza, and what happened to us happened on October 7th. I mean, there was this, both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, but mostly the New York Times had this tremendous in-depth piece on the sexual assaults that took place to the women on October 7th. Now, it was covered extensively in Israel. Why was it covered extensively in Israel? Because in Israel, until then, it was not discussed. It was not discussed in Israel until then because privacy, because it was felt it was too difficult to discuss. It was too depressing to discuss, all sorts of different areas. Keep in mind, the film that was shown to members of Congress, to the UN, has not been shown to the Israeli public. The Israeli public has not seen it. And because the Israeli public has not seen it, Israel has not released it for general release because they're afraid it's going to get back to the Israeli public. Because it's such a horrible film, because it's just a terrible film, because you see people who have privacy issues and family members, etc., being slaughtered on camera, the Israeli government decided not to use this extremely potent piece of evidence. Is it a right decision? Difficult decision. Difficult decision. Ultimately, if we're considered the aggressors in Gaza because we don't show how terrible it was, then I don't know. Look, we see all these people who are denying, these left-wing supporters of Hamas. No, there really wasn't rape. You haven't shown any rape kits, right? Literally, they're talking about the fact there were no rape kits done to the dead women who were killed on October 7th. The fact there were no rape kits done. There was no rape. You see, proof, no rape. And so I was, okay, they killed them, but rape, that you can't do that. So, you've had this problem denying these sort of actions, but ultimately, would it make a difference? Would it make a difference, the fact that, look, from our perspective, from an Israeli perspective, from a Jewish perspective, Hamas on October 7th were no different than the Nazis. I'm not saying it was a Holocaust because it was limited to 1,200 and not 6 million, but the events of the day itself were no different than what the Nazis did when they came into some towns. Matter of fact, they were worse in some cases than what the Nazis did when they came into towns. I don't know of cases of, mass raping going on when the Germans took over a Polish town or whatever else. They just shot everybody. Or took them out to the forest and shot them. But that's a whole other story. So they were Nazis. And when you have Nazis, there's no stopping what you do in order to fight back against Nazis. The United States destroyed Germany in order to conquer it and to wipe out Nazism. The world doesn't accept the fact that all Gazans are Hamas people, although they seem to support Hamas in very large numbers. And every soldier who comes back from Gaza says he goes into every house, and every house seems to have Hamas literature or Hamas things on the walls. And maybe they have to, because otherwise they'll be shot or something. But that's the reality. I'm quite sure that not every German supported the Nazis. As a matter of fact, polls show they didn't. Matter of fact, more Gazans voted for Hamas than Germans voted for the Nazis. But two different worlds, and I don't want to, bring up the anti-Semitic side, but yes, they're just Jews, and we deserve what we get because we're part of the colonial, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, anyone else?
Mark?
Mike? Yes.
This is Claude Bernstein. I saw a piece in Daniel Gordis's email this morning about the Orthodox women. 400 of them signed a letter that their children's blood is not any different than your blood, reaching out to Hasidic women, since the rabbis, etc., aren't doing anything about the fact that all the blood being spilled is everyone but the Hasidim.
Yeah, it's a real problem. At the beginning of the war, they were always, oh, look, all these Hasidim are starting to volunteer. Well, it didn't turn out that very many of them ended up volunteering. Some of them,
200.
Yeah, that's a ridiculous number. Zaka did wonderful work. Zaka is the people who go and basically deal with dead bodies, and of course, you can imagine what they had to deal with on October 7th and the days afterwards. They did tremendous work, without a question. But we're talking about a group of a couple of hundred people maximum. There was an interview with one of the big Rosh Yeshivas, where a colonel, religious, modern religious colonel in the army went to him and said, "Listen, couldn't you at least ask that every bachar, every person, every student in your yeshiva go and do one tanchumei v'lim, in other words, one shiva call, or attend one funeral? That's all. Not asking them to go into the army, I'm not asking them to fight, but just that they should do that to show their solidarity." And his response was a bitul Torah, a waste of Torah time. It was more important that they sit and study Talmud than it is that they fulfill the mitzvah of Tanchumei to pay a shiva call. More important than to attend a funeral. They can't possibly stop their study of Torah. The study of Torah is, of course, just studying the Talmud that was written in Babylonia way back when. So it's a real problem. It's a very big problem. Israel's going to have to deal with this problem. It can't go on because we're also going to need a much bigger army. But I don't see any solutions until, no one's willing to call a spade a spade. No one's willing to call them what they are in terms of their effect on society. And I don't know where we go from there in terms of that.
But this letter was from the 400 women to the Hasidic
right, absolutely.
mothers.
Right, it was absolutely.
Let the mothers decide. We all know who decides what goes on. It's the mothers.
No, the mothers decide on a family basis, but it's the rabbis that decide. And the rabbis are the most problematic group of them because they are who they are. Let's put it that way. I mean, I won't say what I think of most rabbis, at least in this country, but let's just say it's very problematic. There's no way around it. Michael.
Just to, again, not trying to steal your thunder, but to expand on your excellent previous answer. The Nazis to the Jews are the epitome of horror, but a small point when this Soviet Union collapsed and many of the former countries were tearing down the statues of the Russian liberators, the general expression was these were statues to the rapists who came among us. One of the things that brought down Jeffrey Corbyn's Labour government was blatant anti-Semitism that could not be denied throughout the BBC. Much of America or the world just listens to social media, but of the ones who listen to the major press, they have to appeal to some extent to their public. And in America, most of the Black population seem to think the Arabs are blacks like themselves, which is nonsense. Anyway, I just thought I would throw that into the mix.
Absolutely. Seth.
Yeah.
Seth?
No, I was just telling Jim something.
No, it's
Sorry.
not Seth. You're not Beth. Seth. No? Okay, I thought Seth. Someone told me Seth's hand was up.
Mark, I have a question. It's Larry.
Yes.
Given Biden's popularity in Israel and given the importance of the United States support for the effort, is there a serious discussion in any segment there that the United States might back away and that the continuation of the war and the graphics that we're seeing here is undermining Biden's ability to win an election? It's undermining it in college campuses. It's undermining it in swing states like Michigan. And given the importance of the United States here, is that a concern? Is that being considered?
Okay, I think it's a concern, but not in the way you're describing it. In other words, there's a concern about what it's doing to support of Israel, what it's doing for the future generations. There's absolute concern about that. It's discussed, I would say frequently, but it's discussed a lot. A side point I want to make, which is important to understand the context. We in Israel do not see those images from Gaza, and I see some of them on social media and Telegram and those things, but the media in Israel does not show the images of the results of what we do in Gaza. I think it's a mistake, not because we should feel bad per se, although we should be concerned to some extent, but because we need to understand what the world is seeing. If we don't see what the world is seeing, then how do we put what they're saying into context? But we don't see it, so that's a problem in and of itself. I think looking at it from a political analyst for the United States elections, if the election was taking place next month, I would think there'd be a reason to be concerned. The election in November, my guess, and again, this is especially if Trump is the one who ends up running and something doesn't stop him, is that when it comes to push comes to shove, it'll be far enough away and they're going to say, Biden, Trump, Biden, Trump. Well, Biden was really not good on the Middle East, but Trump. And I do not see the college kids staying home or voting for Trump when it comes down to, when that's what it comes down to in the end, if it's far enough away from these events. If this goes on until November, then I don't, all bets are off. But let's, just for the sake of argument, although I said it's a year of war, let's assume in some form or another this all ends by March, April latest. That's a long time in American, America moves on very quickly. Yesterday's story is just that, yesterday's story becomes history, and we know how well Americans know history. So I'm less concerned from the Biden perspective now. I'm more concerned about the long-term support for Israel. That's a different story altogether.
Unfortunately, I'm far less optimistic than you are.
Seth.
Yeah, sorry, I got distracted, but my question had to do with the apparently the ISIS attack on Iran, and how you see that playing into the dynamics of what's going on, if at all.
Okay, so let's put it this way. This wasn't on the playbook. Like everything else that's happened this year, no one saw that coming. They claimed, it was interesting, they made a claim today, the ISIS, that they did this against Iran because their fight against Israel was just one big bluff, and they really weren't interested in fighting against Israel, and so therefore they're the enemies too. And don't forget, there's always been this animus because ISIS is Sunni and Iran is Shiite. So, Iran is blaming us and claiming ISIS is, our puppet. But okay, no one really accepts that. So it adds another element, another unknown element into the mix. I don't know. I mean, to be quite honest with you, I don't know what the impact is. I mean, look, there's something else we didn't discuss also, the constant attacks now against US bases in Iraq and Syria, and the attempt of the Iranians to get the US out of Iraq and Syria. And the US response, if you remember 3 days ago, they attacked one of the militias, the Shiite militias inside of Iraq, killing its leader. So that's another aspect of all that's going on right now. It makes predictions very bad. Let's put it that way. Being in the prediction business, would not be one I'd want to be right now as to how this mix ends up.
I put a question into the chat box.
Okay. I have not been following the chat box. Hold on. Okay. Okay, so there's two questions in the chat box I see here. One is the issue of driving a car, food, water, family. Okay, so covering the story. Well, those are the risks one takes, obviously. Food and water is delivered by trucks. And of course, most of those trucks are being hijacked by Hamas. So again, look, it's dangerous to be moving around Gaza at the moment. That's the reality. I mean, it's a war zone. And I'm sorry that civilians are killed, and I'm sorry that journalists get killed. Are all the people in Gaza Hamas? that's really a hard question to answer, because if you look at the surveys, at least 60 to 70% support what they did. Look, I think we need to start from a very obvious and absolute fact. Whether we eliminate Hamas or not, they're going to hate us. They're going to hate us more after this war than they did before the war. Friends we are not making. Our hope, and this is the hope of all of this, that if you break Hamas, you break the military resistance effort, and Palestinians generally decide the only way to come to any sort of any movement in their favor is by peaceful means. That would be the hope that would come from this war, a successful war, that they give up the armed struggle. Likely, they've been in an armed struggle since the 1960s when they started hijacking planes. But, you know, all wars have to end somehow. And it's not going to end with the extinguishing of the State of Israel. So, you know, I don't know. It's all bad. I mean, that's the reality. Look, Blinken is wanting one thing. The question was asked whether what Blinken wants. Blinken wants a plan. The plan that Netanyahu can't give him because of his political pressures. I don't know what he does. I don't know how we get out of this plunter. A plunter being like a situation where there's no easy solution. But we need a plan. We need a plan for the army. You know, the old saying of Clausewitz that war is an extension of politics by other means. Well, every war ends, every war, including World War II, it all ended, and it ended with some sort of political solution. No, it's not that there's a political agreement with Nazi Germany, but there was a political plan of what to do with Germany after the war. There was discussions that took place starting in 1942 in the Roosevelt administration, and then by 43 with the Allies. What's the plan for Germany after World War II? These things require planning. It requires telling your troops where you want them to be at the end of the war, what you want them to accomplish. Because ultimately, there has to be a political solution to a war. I mean, not a political solution like peace, but something has to come after war. So I don't have a solution to that question. I think it's very problematic, and it's one of our big problems. And the big problem, of course, is that we have two people who I consider, I won't say not sane, but somewhere else altogether ideologically and everything else in our cabinet. And they have very extreme views. And those views do not represent the views of most of the country. Okay, I'll take one more question if there is. And if not,
I have one question.
Go ahead. Good.
So my question goes back to the Houthis. You talked about war. Even in the situation happened within the last week where the U.S. Shot 3 attack boats and killed the militants in those boats. There was actually a 4th boat which got away and was not pursued. Okay, which I think is very significant. And my concern here is that, first of all, this is an international issue. This is not a U.S. versus Houthis issue. This is international shipping. And if the U.S. got really tough with this and went on the attack, the U.S. is not trying to take over Yemen. This is a very different situation than than other of the wars, Afghanistan, etc. Well, this is purely a defensive thing, and the U.S. doesn't need to put any one individual soldier in harm's way. All it needs to do is bomb from the air until the Houthis get it right. Until they back off. Just bomb from the air, bomb from the air, bomb from the air.
Okay, that's what Saudis did. Bomb from the air, bomb from the air, bomb from the air. They didn't put Saudi troops on the ground. They supported the Yemen side in the civil war that was against the Houthis. I'll make 2 comments. First of all, the reason they didn't pursue the fourth ship, in my opinion, is probably the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement probably stated that if you're fired upon, you can fire back. So the 3 ships, the three boats made the most ridiculous idea in the world: shoot at an American armed helicopter, and they got what they deserved. I mean, I can't think of anything more stupid than to shoot at an American armed helicopter above you. I mean, what do you think? You're going to knock down the helicopter, and then even if you did, you think you wouldn't be pursued? You have an aircraft carrier with God knows how, with 100 planes a minute away in terms of air. So they made a stupid comment. The last group ran away. Rules of engagement are if you're not being engaged, you don't engage them. That's the current rules of engagement. Now, you could have a plan that put a a total naval blockade on Yemen that said any vessel that tried to leave, we're going to sink. So that would take care of the little ships that can come out to try to hijack ships. However, they're using ballistic missiles to fire on ships, and these merchant ships do not have, and the American warships all have missiles on them. Much to our pleasant surprise, to be quite honest with you, they seem to be very effective. I'm sure the Chinese are watching and are not all that happy, because the Chinese have built their whole naval strategy on that they would be able to defeat the U.S. fleet by using their missiles to sink the U.S. fleet out of range of the fleet. The fact is, it looks like the U.S. fleet has very effective anti-missile missiles, so that's a good thing. But merchant ships don't have that. So therein lies the other side of the challenge, and how do you negotiate that issue? So you have to take out the missile sites. But as Israel's learned, the only way to take out missile sites ultimately is by being there on the ground, because we didn't succeed in taking out missile sites from the air. That's the reality. During the previous wars with Hamas, until the last day of the war, they will fire missiles, despite the fact that we have total air superiority over Gaza. So I don't know that it's so easy. I don't know that it's easy without boots on the ground, which no one wants. Maybe, but don't know. Okay, everybody.
Okay.
I thank you all for coming, and we'll do
Thank
this
you.
again in 2 weeks. I'm afraid the war will still be going on in 2 weeks in some form or another. So thank you all. Have a peaceful 2 weeks, and let's hope there's good news somehow during that time.